I should start by saying at the outset that the handouts, there was a snafu in what I sent out. So I sent out a draft version to all of you, and it's not the final version that we'll go through tonight, so I apologize for that if you printed that out. We don't have any handouts for tonight as a result, but you will be emailed what we go over tonight. So something happened with my computer, which I think we've solved now. So, but with that, why don't we just take a moment to look at where we've been. So you might recall we started out in class 1 talking about secularism and the crisis of today, which is a decline in reverence of the sacred, or even identifying the sacred in culture. And in class 2, we looked at the decline of the sacred, the transcendent in the church, particularly in architecture, music, teachings on conscience, and on other subjects. And we saw that really the essence of the decline of the sacred involves a rejection of God, a rejection of the absolute good, true, and beautiful. And so that has permeated in our culture and to some extent in the church. In class 3, we looked at the church then as a counterstrike to the nihilism in culture, the church as a sacred sacrament, the union of Christ and his church as a sacramental bond. So tonight we're going to look at marriage and sexuality as another example of a sacred covenant that resembles the covenant that God makes with us in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, Christ in the church. So this is our topic for tonight. Now, I should say at the outset, this is a controversial area that we're going to be walking into. And my charge as Summer School of Faith is to present as openly and honestly as I can what the church is offering and promoting and why. And so please keep that in mind, that as we go through tonight's class, that's my mission, is to present things to you that perhaps the church has mumbled or not said loudly enough to combat the secular in culture, particularly in the area of human sexuality and marriage. Now, the first point here is that nowhere is the loss of the sacred more obvious in culture today than the area of human sexuality. If you just look at what has occurred over the last 50, 60, 75 years in terms of the mores of our culture as it relates to how men and women relate to each other in marriage or outside of marriage, we've seen a drastic change of increased promiscuity, higher divorce rates, you know the litany of various social ills. We're also going to talk about something called Humanae Vitae, which was an encyclical published by Pope Paul VI in 1968, in July. So we're actually celebrating the 51st anniversary of that encyclical this month. And this time frame also shows the abdication, and I use some strong language here, but I feel this way about it, of the abdication and collapse of church leadership in this time in the area of human sexuality and marriage. And I point this out in part because it's a precursor to the abuse crisis today. The abuse crisis of today didn't just come out of nowhere. It percolated, incubated in this crisis of leadership that I've been talking about for the last 50, 60, 70 years in matters sexual. So the abuse crisis of today is actually simply the symptom of something that went horribly wrong 50, 60, 70 years ago in the leadership of the church and in some of its members. So we're going to spend some time on that as well. And I don't say this with any relish when we go through this, but part of the recovery of the sacred is being honest about what happened. and how to fix it. And so then the last two things we'll do is the biblical framework for the church's understanding of human sexuality and marriage, namely as a covenant. And then finally some theological reflections, largely from Pope John Paul II, on that vision. So that's what's on the menu for tonight. So something light and breezy for all of you to enjoy. So let's talk about the big lie that culture tells young people today. And the big lie is that in your sexual lives, you can experience joyous liberation and fulfillment, but is that really the truth? Or is there something more darker and sinister at work? And what I am showing you here is a chart from a book called Pre-Sex in America by Mark Regnerus, which is in your bibliography. And what he is highlighting is a study that was done in 2002, so a bit dated, of about 15,000 men and women between the ages of 18 and 23 on, by tier, lifetime number of sex partners, 0 to more than 11. What is the profile in terms of depression or being on antidepressants? Oops, are the doors locked? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Maybe we leave one open. Yeah. Okay. So you can, what's interesting, and they're comparing women and men. So the slashes here, the first number will be women and then men. You follow that? So, for example, lifetime number of sex partners for people aged between 18 to 23, women to men. If you've had 0 sex partners of this tier, the percent ever diagnosed with depression for women is 10.3%, for the guys 4.7. You see how that works? As you increase your sexual partners, whether it's taking antidepressants or diagnosed, you see how women tend to skew to a higher percentage vis-a-vis men, to the point where if you've had 11 or more lifetime sexual partners between the ages of 18 to 23, women are diagnosed at a 31.6% percentage in this tier, which is why these don't add up to 100. If you see number of sex partners in the last year, 0 to greater than 11 by these tiers. If we just look at the extremes, diagnosed and taking 4.9, 11.7 for women, 48.1 and 29.3, the more sexual partners, the more sexually active you are. What's interesting to note is how it doesn't really change for the guys. And we won't spend a whole lot of time on why that is. I think we tend to know why that is. For those of you who are doctors or know biology, oxytocin is more prevalent as a hormone in women, which is the love potion, the bonding hormone, than it is in boys. And so when love is betrayed or sought in a rather reckless way, there's a greater gap between expectation and the fall and the disappointment, thus the blossoming of greater degrees of depression in women. So just to lighten this, still think boys and girls are the same. So our culture today wants to neuter the difference because, again, nature, being, metaphysics is in the way of human reason and rationality and instrumental changes to how we want to live our lives. So I just point this out that this is not popular. It would be interesting to know what these numbers look like now, 17 years later. My guess is it's even more skewed. So this is the big lie our culture tells young people, and in particular, young women. So the flashpoint, though, for all of this conversation is the publishing of Humanae Vitae in 1968, July. But if we do a quick review of the context, the run-up to the encyclical, we first had the discovery of the female egg in 1827. observed fertilization between egg and sperm under a microscope in 1875. And so with the advance of technology, which is wonderful, you see the beginnings of then how do we manipulate it? How do we manipulate fertility? If we jump ahead to 1930, the Lambeth Conference, a conference held by the Anglican bishops, was the first major Protestant denomination to allow for the use of contraception. Where in 1908 and 1920, they had rejected its use. In 1930, the conference approved the use of artificial contraceptions. Within 5 months of that conference, Pope Pius XI published Casti Connubii, which reaffirmed what I call the perennial teaching of the Catholic Church, rejecting, banning the use of artificial contraceptives in marriage. No change to the teaching, which was by then 1900 years old. Vatican II reaffirms the Church's teaching on contraception with some beautiful statements in various dogmatic constitutions of Vatican II. In 1963, Pope John XXIII appoints a commission to study the question of contraception. He passes away in 1963. Pope Paul VI takes on the commission, expands it, includes married couples, doctors, specialists, and theologians to make recommendation to Pope Paul VI on the Church's teaching in terms of any revisions, any expansion, or change. Pope Paul VI then goes to his summer retreat in July. No one was expecting him to publish anything, but he did. Toward the end of July, he reaffirmed the Church's teaching on the immorality of using contraception to prevent conception in the context of heterosexual marriage. I have to say all of that today because marriage, is it between a man and a woman or not? So he, as I mentioned, courageously overruled the majority opinion of the commission. And dutifully, the media, or people on the commission that leaked to the media their recommendation. And so an expectation was created that Paul VI would change the Church's teaching. And drumbeats, if you read articles of that time, the New Yorker, the New York Times, others, they were beginning to sense a change coming, which they were in favor of. I should also mention that Cardinal Votia, the future John Paul II, was a member of the commission early on, but he was prevented from joining it in its final sessions by the communists in Poland. They were just fine with him attending Vatican II, but they did not allow him to attend the final sessions of the commission. So it would take another 10, 11 years before John Paul II was Pope, and he could fill in the theological vision and develop it further that Paul VI started in that encyclical. And so the encyclical said many things, which we'll get into. It also made predictions, and Paul VI later elaborated on this, that once the state begins to manage this, as he thought would be inevitable, governments and the state managing fertility, that it would lead and be broader than just contraception. It could lead to abortion, higher rates of divorce, promiscuity, and homosexuality being legalized. So very prophetic of Paul VI to see that coming. Now, what's also interesting is the polling data of the time that surrounds the context of the encyclical. What's fascinating to me is in 1968, only 28% of Catholics approved of Humanae Vitae's ban on contraception. 54% were already opposed to the encyclical. We'll see a little bit maybe why that is. By 1971, 58% said a good Catholic could ignore the teaching. 75% between the ages of 18 and 35 thought it wasn't even a moral issue, the use of contraception. So early on, the church was walking against the cultural current of the time. The Pew and latest Gallup poll dating from 2012, although I think this has been updated, but it's been steady for about 40 years, only 15% of Catholics view contraception in marriage as morally wrong. 15%. I should mention that one of the reasons why the culture had shifted even by 1968, and not to date anyone here, but mothers who were having children in the late 50s, early 60s know this by looking at the maternity wards at hospitals and how they changed in the number of babies in the wards was beginning to change, namely go down. Another reason is the pill came out in 1960. So you had several years, and we'll point to some other things as well, like Griswold versus Connecticut, which in the Supreme Court discovered a right to privacy, which prevented states from banning contraception due to the right of privacy of couples. But if we look at a closer look at what Humanae Vitae actually said, also beyond just those headlines, which were ingested in the popular press, we go beyond. Paul VI locates the entire conversation in the context of marriage, conjugal love in marriage. That's what he's trying to defend. That's what he is trying to promote with the encyclical. And early on in that encyclical, he says that conjugal love in marriage has certain attributes. The first one being it's a human act. Sex is not just acting from instinct, though it involves the instincts and inclinations and desires. But it's not simply that. It's not reducible just to that. Secondly, it's total. It seeks the good of the other in totality. It's not merely self-absorbed, nor should it be self-absorbed in any primary sense. Third, faithful and exclusive, meaning monogamy, one partner for life that you are faithful to. Another aspect of conjugal love is the possibility of fruitfulness by co-creating with God, due to the procreative dimension of human sexuality. The other being the unitive aspect, the intimacy of the couple. So in Paul VI, in reflecting on what does it mean to promote conjugal love, these are the attributes. And the very act of human sexuality involves two fundamental dynamics that God put in it by design: the intimacy of the couple and the possibility of procreation and co-creating with God. What's interesting in the encyclical is Paul VI put those two things, the unitive dimension and the procreative dimension, on an equal footing. Historically, in the Church's teaching, procreation had been the primary reason for human sexuality. Interestingly, in the development of this, and it will get further definition with John Paul II, the intimacy of the couple and the possibility of generating life are put on the same plane, the same basis. Also in the encyclical, Pope Paul VI talked about the notion of responsible parenting. And what he had in mind here is perhaps due to circumstances with a couple, financial, emotional, or whatever they might be, to abstain from sex in order to avoid having children in a marriage that it might not be suitable for the children for a variety of reasons. Laid out in that encyclical. And he further goes on to describe that in the case of, say, a woman who might be taking medication for high blood pressure or to treat some significant disease, if that medication has the side effect of preventing conception, that is permissible. provided that effect is foreseen and not intended. So if I'm taking medication that prevents conception, if I'm taking that to handle a high blood pressure condition or asthma or something else that could be life-threatening, I might also know that it could have the effect of rendering infertile sex with my partner, my wife. And so, but I can foresee that without intending it because I'm taking the medication to deal with the ailment. And in fact, my asthma or high blood pressure isn't cured by us being infertile. It's not the means to that end. So you see the difference? This is not ends justify the means. This is the principle of double effect, which maybe we'll spend some time on. So the infertility is not achieved by means of the remedying of the asthma or the high blood pressure. But sexual acts in marriage that lack these attributes, Paul VI says, are deficient morally. So we'll pause here briefly to then talk about something a bit more sensitive and tender. But what happened? Why was the reception of this encyclical and the teaching of the church, which had been its teaching for 1900 years, been so utterly rejected? 15% of Catholics once it came out. Well, the 1960s happened. Questioning authority, the Vietnam War, the Woodstock generation, the campus riots that occurred in the U.S. and all over Europe. This is just an anecdote, but when I was out at the seminary, you'll see in one of the buildings the class photos that go all the way back to 1915 to the present. And so Mundelein, the seminary, opened, I think, in like 1915, or someone will correct me, 1914. And you see the classes and the class sizes. Everyone from 1914 to about 1967 has military haircuts, no mustaches, no beards. And then somewhere, if you were just an observer from Mars, you'd say something happened in 1968. We have bad hair, we have sideburns, we have awful beards and mustaches. What happened? Someone should have tapped them on the shoulder and says, guys, get a haircut, But, and then as I mentioned, 1965, the Supreme Court ruled that states may not ban the use or the sale of contraceptives. Had a huge impact on how the culture viewed the morality of using contraception. And the Supreme Court invented the right to privacy. I put that there because that's what they did. So, I should also mention, as I mentioned earlier, that the pill actually was first distributed in 1960 to the general public, and oddly enough, although we shouldn't necessarily think it odd given what has happened, but a Catholic physician was instrumental in the development of the pill. A man named John Rock, who also published a book later in 1963 entitled The Time Has Come, namely for the broad use of artificial contraception. So you see, in the run-up to 1968, the tree is being chopped down already. Also, the church did not adequately defend its vision of human sexuality in marriage, what was called then the rhythm method. And you can see how doctors probably could explain this better than priests. Priests were uncomfortable talking about the plumbing. And so you can see how the church turned into a kind of scold. You may not use artificial contraception. Well, why? Well, you shouldn't. And that's not convincing. That wasn't persuasive. You had to believe with a certain vivacity of faith to accept that teaching. And with the rise of the pill, which Dr. Rock argued it's natural, it's a dose of estrogen, after all, why not? We use shampoo to deal with things from nature that aren't desirable. So why not the pill? And so this was in the air. And you can see how the church had not adequately elaborated what we would call today from John Paul II the theology of the body, and a vision of Catholic marriage that incorporates human sexuality fully. So the pill was a huge inbreak, and it affected the sexual practices of that time, and it affects them today. And just to lighten things a little bit, this is, for those of you who might remember your economics class, this is a supply and demand curve. And let's take the example of hybrid cars. The actual cost of hybrid cars without subsidies, which is why they're around, they're making breakthroughs, in not only the battery technology, but in the manufacture of them. And so the cost is coming down. When a larger volume of them are being produced. So Ford is going to start making more electric cars in addition to Tesla. Once supply increases at a lower cost, a lower price, with the same demand, you get a lower price for the item. Whether it's electric cars, could be natural gas or oil. If we discovered, think of the wonders of fracking in the last 15 years, unleashing huge supplies of oil and natural gas. What happened to the price of gasoline? It went down. So when supply becomes more available and this supply curve shifts out to a greater quantity, more is demanded at a lower price. So this is high school economics of supply and demand. The more you get of something at a lower cost, the more will be demanded at a lower price. What did the pill do for sexual activity? It lowered the price for men. So the pill empowered, in quotes, because this is the lie that women were told at the time, empowered women to enter the sexual marketplace, and that increased the supply of sex for men. Increased quantities, lowered prices for men. So before, in 1955, I'd have to marry her. Now, maybe it's 2 to 3 dinners. Or maybe it's one drink at PJ Clark's downtown on a Friday night. You see what happened? The price to men went down. So more of it was demanded. More of it was provided. You see how crushing that is. And it creates the huge headwind for any teaching of the church on human sexuality. It also is one of the phenomena on why not only are people getting married older, or they're not getting married at all. Why should I marry? The old expression, I'm getting the milk, I'm getting the eggs, and so forth. This is just human nature. So without the moral fiber, without the vision, the theological and spiritual resources to combat this, the church was very exposed in the culture. And it really took John Paul II and the pastoral and theological depth that the man had to write this. But alas, there was a bit of time between 1968 and 1978 when John Paul became Pope, and obviously his pontificate didn't solve this, but it did give the church more resources to re-evangelize the culture. But let me just point out a few things. We shouldn't pretend these did not happen, and we can see how they are a straight line to the abuse crisis of today. So let's just pick at a few of these, and then we'll move on to the more positive stuff. But the day the encyclical was published at the end of July, you guys might remember this, a priest, theologian by the name of Charles Curran, had a press conference in 1968. And he presented a document signed by 600 other theologians, Catholic and Protestant theologians, publicly opposing the teaching. And as I put, and nothing happened to him. I'm not saying he should have been, taken to jail, of course not. Nothing happened to him until 1986, when John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger removed him from his teaching position at Catholic University of America. It took 18 years for anyone to do anything about it. That's what I'm talking about. That's what sowed the seeds for where we are today. So he was finally, in hushed tones, informed that he was no longer a Catholic theologian and could no longer teach at a Catholic university. Yeah. I mean, when you're in business, this is incomprehensible to you. Imagine, so I can remember, as I've maybe mentioned in the past, I used to run 4 food manufacturing facilities throughout the U.S. and 1 in Mexico. And we had, of course, a SKU list of products we made. So imagine if we lay out the forecast at corporate, and one of the plant managers calls me and says, "We're not making that. We're going to make something else." Oh, okay. We're not going to make food here. We're going to make shoes. It's incomprehensible. The man would be fired that day. And this is a common phenomenon among bishops and priests, good men who cannot lead groups. So this is just so obvious to me what happened. Weak leadership by university presidents and rectors. Some of you might remember the Land O'Lakes Conference of 1967, a gathering sponsored by Father Ted Hesburgh, the president of Notre Dame at the time, and he called together various presidents of universities, Fordham, Georgetown, others, Marquette, lots of Jesuits there, and they basically severed their ties with the church formally and set up lay boards of trustees to run the colleges and universities, all under the idea of autonomy. Free inquiry and academic excellence requires not the heavy hand of the church on us, as if free inquiry in pursuit of the truth is in any way in opposition to the church and its faith. So this is another example of the secularism and weakness of the time by leaders in the church, particularly in rectors and presidents of Catholic universities. And of course, the character of those institutions changed. You might be, well, what could the bishops do? After all, the property often was in the name legally of the religious order. What could a bishop in South Bend do about it? And the answer, of course, is he could have said to the presidents, and could say today, that you may not say Mass or perform any sacraments on your campus. And you may not use the name Catholic in your charter. You may not market yourself as a Catholic institution. Those presidents in 1967 would have folded like these silly chairs. They would have collapsed. But instead, the bishops, by their silence and weakness, allowed Catholic institutions to drift from molding students in a Catholic way. Here's a quote from Janet Smith. Perhaps you've heard of her, a well-known Catholic theologian. But at the time, even, faithful theologians were demoted or abandoned at this time as well. But quote from Janet Smith, "Dissenting theologians rightly boasted that they had won. They had control of the episcopacy, the major Catholic universities and most of the colleges, professional organizations and journals. Those preparing for marriage were told that they were free to use contraception. Even those who confessed to using contraception were told that there was no sin involved if they were following their consciences." Remember, we spent time on that in a class or two ago. "It was next to impossible for a theologian who was faithful to the church teaching to get a job in most Catholic universities and colleges, and even many dioceses, no matter how distinguished their degrees, no matter how sophisticated their research and writing." At the time the encyclical was published, various bishop conferences, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Germans, issued statements saying, well, yes, this is the teaching, but concerns of conscience can outweigh the teaching. And then, of course, you had here and there, you had heroic bishops and priests defending the truth, but by and large, you had Canadian and U.S. bishops beginning to pull back, remain silent, or give cover to the culture. So it's no accident, that we are where we are. So I know you might have questions about that, but I'd like to keep rolling to get now to what the Catholic vision is of sex in marriage. And what it is, if we start with just the biblical framework from the Old Testament, and then we'll just spend a few moments on a few lines from Genesis. The biblical framework is marriage is a covenant, and sex is an expression that seals the covenant in marriage. The Hebrew word for it is berit. Now, covenant is this fundamental spiritual reality of the Old Testament. In fact, it is the reality of the Old Testament, the covenant between Yahweh, God, and the people of Israel. It's why they were led out of the desert to receive the Ten Commandments, the covenant, the dietary laws that make up their identity as people. A covenant is different than a contract. As I mentioned here, a contract is a legal agreement between parties, made before witnesses, involves collateral often, and if you break the covenant, you lose the property. Interestingly, the old Code of Canon Law from 1917 and prior theology spoke of marriage as a contract with rights that the parties confer on each other on their wedding day. Not exactly the biblical idea. Covenant is an oath of fidelity, a little different feeling to it, between parties made before God, in which one promises one's very self to the other. This is precisely how Genesis describes Yahweh's relationship to Abraham, and the people of Israel. And we read in the 15th chapter of Genesis how Yahweh cuts a covenant, karat berit, with Abram, and they split animals in half, and both parties walk between the split animals, indicating that if they broke the covenant, their lives are forfeited. This covenant, as I mentioned here, is an unconditional one, a personal form of fidelity that, though it can be violated or even broken, still calls forth this total self. It's fidelity. It's a covenant. It's not a contract. There's something much more holistic about a covenant theology than contracts. And as Grabowski, that's actually his last name. I'm sorry but in the era of the Chicago Bears and Mike Ditka, they were called Grabowskis. But in any event, he finishes, it is precisely because of the total claim that it makes on a person that a covenant creates a new relationship between its parties. So the essential elements to covenant ceremonies in ancient times and in the Old Testament is an oath, invoking God as a witness to the terms, and something that seals the covenant. So, quote from Grabowski, also essential to covenant ceremonies is some act that seals or enacts agreement. Thus, following Yahweh's revelation of himself and his laws to the Israelites at Sinai, the people 3 times expressed their consent to the words of the Lord. Yes, we agree to the covenant. Yes, yes. And then are sprinkled with the blood of their peace offerings. In this case, the blood symbolizes the bond between God and his people and their sharing of a common life. It should be remembered that the Israelites held blood to be sacred precisely because it was understood to contain the very life of the creature. Given this belief, one can begin to discern the role of blood in covenant ritual. The blood indicates not only the community of life among the covenant parties, but also the sanctification or being set apart of the object or persons in whom it marks. That Exodus reference is to the ritual of Passover, of killing a 1-year-old male lamb and sprinkling its blood on the doorposts so that the Spirit of God would pass over. Such being made holy through sacrificial blood also recalls the demands made on those parties to a covenant. The life of the creature forfeited in the sacrifice, the lamb, or offering bespeaks the totality of the claim made upon the faithful Israelite in his covenant with Yahweh. And as we will see in marriage, sexual intimacy is what seals the oath between a man and a woman. But if we continue and we look at Genesis 2, but even throughout all of the Old Testament, we see God's relationship to Israel described as a covenant, like a marriage. You might recall from past year's classes, the prophet Hosea, when Israel strays from the covenant, he calls them a harlot. He calls them a prostitute. Very vivid marriage-like terms. You have broken the covenant. You're unfaithful. This isn't the breaking of a legal contract. We see in Genesis 2:18 to 25, as I mentioned, the second creation account. There are two creation accounts, if you recall, from Genesis. So bye-bye Bible-only faiths, bye-bye biblical literalism. You couldn't have these accounts and understand them if you were a biblical literalist or, frankly, a Bible-only church. But how do you decide? Was man created on the sixth day in chapter 1, at the end, after all the animals? Or was he created in the second account in chapter 2, first, before the animals? That's kind of a big deal, don't you think? By the way, not to poke fun, but I have to lighten this, otherwise the sun was created on the fourth day in the first account in chapter 1. How do you have a day? How do you have days 1, 2, and 3 if the sun was created on day 4? But we'll pass over that because that's... Okay. So we're looking at the second account of creation in chapter 2 of Genesis, which people think is probably from the 10th century BC of when this was formulated in its original form. And God notices in this account, it's not good for man to be alone. Recall Adam, which is Hebrew for man, was created from the dust, and God breathed life into him. So God creates animals and sends them toward Adam, saying, maybe these will be a suitable partner for the man. And Adam names them, and nomos in Greek means law, which means he had dominion over the animals by naming them. It's where our Latin word nomen comes from, naming. It comes from a Greek word meaning law, lawgiver. So, thus the essence of the stewardship of creation. These are not suitable partners for man in his deepest covenantal being. So what happens next? Yahweh casts a deep sleep on the man, the Hebrew word being tardama, which will be reused throughout the Old Testament. And it always precedes a covenant being made. So Yahweh casts a deep sleep on Abram before he established the covenant with Abraham. Job sleeps prior to divine revelation of God, from God. The creation of the woman in Genesis is the start of the Old Testament covenant. The yes of Mary, a woman, will be the start of the second covenant in Jesus Christ, the definitive covenant. So all through the door of womanhood, these covenants are enacted. So the drama of the chapter 2 reaches its height when God presents the woman to Adam and he says, "This one at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one has been taken." There's a play on words here in the Hebrew that we might miss in English, but the bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh is also used throughout the Old Testament in the context of allegiances and oaths, and I give some examples of that from 2 Samuel. But this exclamation or sigh of Adam, "at last," also shows this play on words of Ish, which means man in Hebrew, and Isha, which means woman, this figure of speech, because Ish is taken from Isha. And so the woman is out of man. Isha from ish. So there's this covenantal union from the beginning between man and woman. But the narrative does not stop there. We have the editorial comment by the writer of Genesis. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one body. So we're building on the covenant in creation of man and woman to an intimacy between man and woman. And the editor, the narrator of this scene, says this is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. And the leave and forsake, again, are words that Hebrew readers would identify with that are used throughout the Old Testament, that relate to leave and forsake for the purpose of fidelity. And the cling word that is used there also indicates this holding fast and obedience to God, Yahweh. So readers of this would immediately get the sense of this being covenant marriage theology. As we read again from Grabowski, emerging from his covenant sleep, because recall, whenever people go to sleep in the Old Testament, a covenant is established, whether it's Abram and others. Emerging from his covenant sleep, the man binds himself to the woman by an oath. This oath is then used as an explanation for man's leaving his family and clinging to his wife so that together they form a new entity, the one flesh. This term denotes the new familial communion that the oath creates between male and female, a communion that includes and is expressed by sexual intimacy. The hint of this is that the man and his wife were both naked, yet they felt no shame. So you have, as Grabowski mentions toward the bottom here, it is the embodied gesture that expresses the new relationship with their covenant creates between them. Sex, therefore, as a recollection and enactment of the covenant oath, takes on a liturgical function within the marriage, akin to other covenant-making gestures. Sexual union is thus understood. That recalls precisely the totality of a couple's gift to one another expressed in their oath. So you see that yet they felt no shame is also hinting at post-fall, post-original sin. Sexual relationships will become a source of conflict also. And shame will be felt when one party objectifies the other, excludes them from a covenantal love, which is the definition of making an object of the other. I no longer view them as a person on the same plane, but rather as something for me and my desires. But we'll spend a little time on that. Let's pivot. I might have more slides than we have time. So I tell you what we don't cover here, we'll either cover in the next class or we'll figure something out. But I will intelligently breeze through what I have left. But you'll also get it by email as well. If we see John Paul II come on the scene forcefully, and for 30, 40 years he had been writing exactly along these lines. In particular, in his Wednesday audiences on the theology of the body is precisely on the book of Genesis, all throughout the late 70s, 79, and early 80s. And so this is what he took up as a priority. Remember we talked about leadership is about priorities? This is leadership. So he starts with two things. One, biblical love as covenant in Genesis requires the total self. And two, this new covenant in Jesus Christ is emblematic of his incarnation. He took on a human nature, and he unites himself to the church. And on your wedding day, you might have recalled formulas said by the priest that your love for your husband or wife on the wedding day is a symbol of Christ's love for his church, which is total, exclusive, self-giving, perpetual. Quote, and now I'm quoting from an encyclical of John Paul II, Familiaris Consortio. When couples by means of recourse to contraception, so now I'm going to touch ground with, again, the issue of contraception. When couples by means of recourse to contraception separate these two meanings, the unitive and the procreative, that God the Creator has inscribed in the being of man and woman and in their dynamism of their sexual union, so by the recourse to contraception, they act as arbiters of the divine plan, and they manipulate and degrade human sexuality, and with it themselves and their married partner, by altering its value of total self-giving. Now, how is the couple doing that? Thus, the innate language that expresses the total reciprocal self-giving of husband and wife is overlaid through contraception by an objectively contradictory language, namely that of not giving oneself totally to the other. This leads not only to a positive refusal to be open to life, but also a falsification of the inner truth of conjugal love, which is called upon to give itself in personal totality. You notice here we're not even talking about commandments, we're not talking about law, we're talking about a Christian personalism, a totality of human fulfillment. The content of their participation in Christ's life is also specific. Conjugal love involves a totality, there it is again, in which all the elements of the person enter: appeal of the body and instinct, power of feeling and affectivity, aspiration of the spirit and of the will. It aims at a deeply personal unity, the unity that beyond union in one flesh leads to forming one heart and soul. It demands indissolubility and faithfulness in definitive mutual giving, and it is open to fertility. Why? Because that is inscribed in the nature of human sexuality, this unitive and procreative dimension. And to suppress one through the manipulation of technology, whether it's a pill or a condom, you are not expressing the totality of conjugal love. You are falsifying it, deforming it. That's what the Pope is after. This is what the Church is after, to promote authentic human love in marriage. So this is not about being repressed or prissy about sex or anything like that. This is about promoting healthy sex in the context of conjugal love. So you see then why the Church is trying to protect covenantal love in marriage. So fornication is wrong because it's certainly not exclusive. It's taking place outside the context of this committed sacramental bond of marriage. And as I put here, you're saying with your body what you have not said with your whole person. And in fact, what you're saying is a lie. You're saying something that you have not said with your whole person. It's deformed. It's not a true act of love. This is why homosexual acts are wrong, because they, in principle, can never express this complementarity between a man and a woman, as well, which is the essence in terms of the sex of the man and woman, their complementarity, as well as be fruitful and multiply. You cannot say it. You can say it with your mind, but you can never say it with your whole person. It's in principle unable to be covenantal love. Unlike a heterosexual couple who are living together, that marriage could be, that union eventually could be blessed in the Church. Why? Because it is not formally impossible for a man and a woman living together, to have their marriage blessed, because there is the complementarity of a man and a woman. There is the possibility of fruitfulness. In a homosexual relationship, there is lacking a fundamental constituent of conjugal love, which is the complementarity of the sexes and the possibility of fruitfulness, of co-generating with God. Can you hold that question? I apologize. Yeah. So this is why the church is not picking on homosexuals when it says that the orientation itself is a moral disorder, because it can never find a place in a covenantal sacramental bond of marriage. And the only sanctioned use of our sexual powers is in the context of heterosexual covenantal marriage. Why? Because the church is interested in promoting authentic human love. That's why. Now, homosexuals have a legitimate gripe about the church today because the church hasn't talked about marital chastity for 50 years. So why are you picking on homosexuals today? So there is a legitimate gripe if someone would only just explain what we're going through to everyone. We wouldn't, you see how if you don't address issues immediately in the 60s, they fester, they get larger, they get pushed and pulled in 50 different directions. And so by priests and bishops sitting on their hands and not talking about this and leading accordingly, you have this very lopsided and uninformed view of human sexuality that the church is actually on for promoting. When was the last time you had a homily on any of this? So this, and as I put here, this is recycled ancient paganism, this separating, as we had talked about, this ancient Gnosticism of separating body from soul, matter from spirit. Matter is opaque to the spirit. There's no connection between the two. The body is mere tool, mere instrument, mere blank canvas for my mind to draw whatever the heck it wants on, to manipulate it. The body has no significance in anything we might discover, in its natural ends or design. That's all parrot talk. True human flourishing is about using our reason, instrumental reason, to manage the grubbiness of being human in our bodily sense. So I can change my identity, I can change my gender, I can use in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination, on and on and on. I can fumble with the levers of creation and the plumbing based upon convenience that reason and technology provide. You see how Gnostic that is in our culture today? So and this is why on the chart we had people experiencing depression, being on antidepressants. When you act Gnostically, when you separate body from soul and act in a fragmented way, you become a stranger to yourself. The momentary ecstasy of illicit sex, you come down from that and realize that you have nothing permanent. You begin to become fragmented, scattered. And this is the basis for shame. When you make yourself an object or another person, shame and guilt are actually healthy. If you didn't have them, this is why we think serial killers are so awful. They stroll into the courtroom and they're calm as can be, and we think they're crazy. Why aren't they feeling any guilt for the victims? Why do we affirm that as healthy, namely a serial killer feeling guilt and thinking he's nuts when he doesn't, but then when we're in matters of sexuality, you better not feel any guilt for anything you do? You see how the lies our culture continues to tell itself. So I will pause for questions here. This is the heart of what I wanted to cover, but I'll stop at the moment. So the question is, what about couples who have stopped having sex? And then secondarily, what if one party or the other, or both, are infertile? So keep in mind that sexual expression seals the covenant, but it's not the essence of marriage. The essence of marriage are those attributes that we're talking about of fidelity, exclusivity, monogamy, permanence. And so those are the core elements which are the essence of marriage. So couples that are physically incapacitated or just older or loss of sexual interest, they have sealed their covenant perhaps before, or if they marry later in life and don't have sex, that's not the essence of marriage. What sexuality does in marriage is it seals. It's the deepest expression physically of the covenant. Good question. Yes. So the comment is, in the early 60s, there was more emphasis on the natural law as a basis for the church's position on contraception in marriage. And that is true. The encyclical of Pope Pius XI in 1930, Casti Connubii, talks about the law of nature and the law of God on why the use of artificial devices are inappropriate, immoral in marriage. There was less emphasis on that when Paul VI and then John Paul II began to elevate natural law to be more personal. That these ends we find in sex have to be elevated to human flourishing, which natural law theory always talked about, but to the point of connecting it to covenant theology of the Old and New Testament, that marriage is not a contract. Marriage is a covenant, which implies this total gift of self, which has the underpinnings of how sex is designed, which natural law theory elaborates and rests on that. But conjugal love expressed this totality first. And this totality includes the ends that we find in sex of procreation and intimacy, love and life, the shorthand. And to eliminate one is to deform that act of love, is to suppress full conjugal covenantal love. So just as with contraception we suppress fertility, so too with in vitro fertilization and artificial insemination, we're suppressing intimacy. So fertility is happening in a petri dish or in the woman after the manner of manufacturing a product. So that has its own destructive signature. So just as contraception separates fertility from love and intimacy, so in vitro fertilization and artificial insemination separates love from fertility. But the weakness then of not connecting it to this Christian humanism, this Christian personalism rooted in the Old and New Testament, is we frustrate natural processes all the time with medications that help blood pressure or metformin to assist with diabetes. We're constantly, through technology, and thank goodness we have it, manipulating environments ourselves through medication, drugs, or other technological means to overcome natural processes. I might color my hair. Yeah, I might go to the Brian Urlacher Hairline Creations. I want to frustrate a natural process that's going on. So you see, natural law theory by itself, not connected to theology and the Bible, is kind of a withering flower that grew in another culture, another environment, and our new times demand a more radical connection of the ends we find in marriage and sex being elevated to the person in this covenant theology that we're talking about, to be persuasive, to be positive. That's the difference. Yes?
Just a comment.
Right. So the question or comment is more, are there not situations where the health of the woman would be at risk with another pregnancy? And there could be, and there are cases like that. I think of one case of someone with very high blood pressure, and carrying a pregnancy to term would be life-threatening. These couples are called to heroic abstinence. I will not sugarcoat this to you, because you cannot achieve a good end, namely not becoming pregnant, to use any means you want. What if the husband said to the wife, well, then I'm going to have sex with someone else? And she said, okay. You see how, where does that logic stop? Okay. Let me go to one last slide. And again, you will get this via email. But one of the common questions that come up is, well, given the intention is the same between using natural methods of abstaining during fertile periods of the woman versus an artificial device or the pill, the intention's the same. So what's the real difference? And John Paul II elaborates several, and other theologians do as well, but there is a difference between abstaining during fertile periods where you are recognizing and not positively preventing fertility and conception versus proactively and positively taking a pill or donning a condom or something else to positively prevent conception. The difference is, one is respecting the order in nature, how sex was designed, and participates in this covenant of love. And the second is taking positive measures to prevent it from even happening. This is what John Paul II is talking about, this manipulation. And that's the difference. The other difference is the virtue of chastity and continence, which I will move to the end. But, oops. I guess we have a little bit of time, but the virtue of continence is the temporary abstaining from sex during fertile times for the greater good of the marriage. And this is not just a contraceptive gesture or act. And so let me read this quotation to you. The utilitarian interpretation distorts the true character of what we call the natural method, which is that it is based on continence, which is a virtue. And this is very closely connected with the love of the person. Inherent in the essential character of continence as a virtue is the conviction that the love of man and woman loses nothing as a result of temporary abstention from erotic experiences, but on the contrary, gains. The personal union takes a deeper root, grounded as it is above all in the affirmation of the value of the persons, and not just in sexual attachment. Continence as a virtue cannot be regarded as a contraceptive measure. It in fact is something positive for the relationship, positive for the marriage. And so to just wrap up here then, this is the virtue of chastity. So we don't see little girls named Chastity anymore. We get Prudence, we get Faith, we get Hope. We don't get Fear of the Lord. But no one names their little girl Chastity anymore. If I'm wrong, correct me. Because chastity is viewed as almost this odd, repressed, weird, crazy thing that 15% of Catholics do to themselves. In fact, chastity lets you in on a little secret about what is the true basis of this full conjugal love in marriage. And in quoting from Grabowski again, and he's referring to Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, when he was a cardinal, writing a book called Love and Responsibility. In the 60s, the Pope was writing this way. But Karol Wojtyła would see chastity as not merely the mastery of reason over the passions, nor still less a flight from all sexual activity, but rather a form of self-possession that makes sexual and other forms of self-donation possible, the gift of self. The total gift of self. Chastity serves to integrate rather than repress or sublimate both sexual desire and the range of human affectivity in the service of love. Indeed, chastity cannot be considered apart from the virtue of love. You see how everything we've been talking about is ordered to authentic love in marriage. Continence is another term for self-mastery that makes the gift of self in love possible. A person can only truly give as a gift that which they first possess. This is particularly true in the case of the gift of self. To give oneself in the absence of this possession is to be compelled by various kinds of drives or impulses rather than to genuinely offer oneself in freedom, end quote. So, as I put here, chastity is not some repressive, thou shalt not. Just as eating a healthy diet is not a hatred of food. Or working out in the gym is a hatred of the body. Of course not. In fact, working out enables your body over time to have more endurance, more strength, more flexibility. It broadens your range of motion. So too, chastity allows you to offer yourself fully, completely in love. It's power. That's what the virtues are. They're powers. Vir virtus, man, manly. They are powers of the soul to live and act and think rightly in a way that promotes human flourishing. And so in the end, every human person, single or married, is a covenant, in a covenant relationship in marriage, or a covenant in waiting. You are honoring yourself by abstaining from sex so that you may honor your future husband or wife. So for young people, you are like a sentinel waiting for the dawn of true love to come. And you guard, as a sentinel does, yourself, your heart, your mind, your body, so that you may love fully. And if you are in marriage, in a covenantal marriage, you should think through the subjects we've talked about tonight on how sex is obviously not the only way, but in the context of conjugal love, what we're talking about is what promotes the deepest depth of love in marriage. So with that, I'll end with this final quote from John Paul II. Why the church insists on these things against the popular opinions of the time, and why it always will. And this is true of any teaching of the church. The church wishes to serve this single end, that each person may be able to find Christ, in order that Christ may walk with each person the path of life, with the power of the truth about man and the world that is contained in the mystery of the incarnation and the redemption, and with the power of love that is radiated by that truth. So that's why the church takes these stands. And in this class, we've talked about how marriage and sexuality is this covenant of love. And the church promotes this because it's interested in promoting this walk we have with Jesus, this person who came and saved us. So with that, that ends the presentation formally. Are there any final questions on the material we've covered this evening? I threw a lot at you, a lot to think about, isn't it? And but the good news is that these themes I'm talking about are on the march again. And happy to tell you that at Mundelein and other seminaries, good priests are being formed in these principles. And they're talking about them with couples. They're talking about them in their homilies at Mass. And so we're seeing this big ship begin to turn again. And I am very optimistic for that reason. So,
what about leadership?
So the question is, what about leadership? And again, this will be a continuing theme of appointing priests and then promoting priests to bishops who love the truth, love and express it the way John Paul II loved and expressed it. So, well, very good. We'll see you next week. And our last topic will then be a spiritual reflection on conversion. Because as we've talked about, making the sacred present is not some theological idea primarily. It's a person, Jesus Christ. And the beauty of the incarnation, which continues in the church and in the lives of all holy men and women, is what we're called to do to make the sacred present. So that will be next week in our final class. Thanks, everybody.